Hello, class. We're back to looking at theories about the state because we want to understand how do people come up with the idea of states using force or states using co-option. So we looked a little bit into theory supporting co-option in the first part of the lecture. And we looked at, ideas by Gramsci. We looked at ideas by Benedict Anderson. So let's now look at ideas that people provided regarding use of force. So the first part is Charles Tilly. So Tilly basically looked at the history of states, how they came about. And he says basically that the state is actually a racket. It's a racketeering agent, basically, and a system. So he says that states are just thugs that matured, over time and became these institutions. So in the medieval era in Europe, there were these thugs basically that were paid to protect people in, villages, and those thugs became more and more powerful. And eventually institutionalized, they became more of an institution. So then we have these monarchy systems eventually, and we have more democratic forms today. So his idea is the state is actually a racket, and essentially that means that there's a mob that's benefiting from money that we give them, right? So we are giving them some kind of taxes, and in return they protect us, and somebody is part of this racket, and basically they are benefiting from this. So we can actually find this kind of racketeering system. You look at the British East India Company, which landed in India in the 1660s. The first thing it did was offer money, or rather protection, to the Mughals in exchange for money. So they got gold, jewelry, crops, all kinds of things. They would use that to trade with China, but this was their business. So other than that, you've had people look at the use of force. Max Weber is one of them. But before Weber, there's Hobbes. Hobbes is the original guy that looks at the English Civil War, right? And he says that if you want to crush civil war, you have to have a powerful state which can use force. So the whole idea about states using force, having the right to use force or monopoly to use force, it all comes from Hobbes. And Hobbes basically says that it's much better to have this kind of a powerful state than to have civil war, because civil war is essentially destructive. People die, your ability to engage in the market is destroyed. If you can't bring your produce to the market and sell anything, you won't even have any produce. It'll be destroyed by the war. Somebody will, go and destroy your crops, maybe set them on fire, or throw napalm bombs on them or something. In any way, your general livelihood is destroyed, your family is destroyed, wherever you kept your money, maybe those banks have been destroyed. So there's really nothing left. Your friends and family, everything have been uprooted. Your way of life has been dismantled. So he's, not making, not, everybody can agree with Hobbes on that, right? So he's absolutely getting an entire audience to agree with him when he writes like that. So he says, create this crazy type of a state that, is all powerful. That's why he calls it the Leviathan, which is a kind of monster, right? So from Hobbes, we make the jump to Max Weber. Weber is looking at the state and saying, well, the state has the monopoly over violence, or over the use of violence, right? So you're looking at the police and the army. You're looking at, other forms that the state can use to maintain order. So by modern state, he means states that are nation states, which have become these larger states. They're no longer city states. In the more recent times, most European states have been formed by all the city states coming together, right? We see that in France, we see that with Germany and other states, Italy especially, and England as well. So these states are modern in the sense that now they have the allegiance of the people because they form nations with these ideologies, right? And so now they can raise money by use of taxes, and they can maintain large standing armies, right? So let's see. So then Marx and Engels are the other group that look at states, especially capitalist states, but also other kinds of states. And they always say, well, the states actually represent the interests of the ruling elites. In a capitalist state, the ruling elites will be the capitalist class, right? They're the people who are basically controlling what kind of production happens in a country. So he's saying that actually the capitalist class, it's their little executive committee, their friends who are running the countries. So Marx and Engels call the state the executive committee of the capitalist class, okay? Today, if we look at the US, we know that 1% of the population controls over 90% of the business or the capital in the country. And so these kinds of ideas appeal to people when they see this kind of inequality. Marx wrote Capital, which basically looked at class conflict within the factories of England. By class conflict basically means who are the people who are involved in the production process. We know that the workers are the people who are working. They are called the proletariat, and the people who own the capital are the capitalists, right? So he's saying that these two groups are completely at odds with each other. If you look at the workers, their living condition in the 19th century was horrible. They were working in very dangerous factories. They were working 18-hour days. They didn't have vacations. They used to work 6-hour weeks, or 6-day weeks rather. And they were very alienated from their work, meaning that they didn't like their working conditions. They worked in harsh working conditions. And they worked in, didn't really make much money, right? So all this exploitation eventually caused workers to band together. And you see this a lot in revolutions, that the people are sort of becoming aware of their misery and they're banding together because they see that other people are equally as miserable as they are, right? So in the workers' conditions, the situations were so bad that the workers were able to unite and form resistance against the capitalists. So they would shut down the factories, they would not work, all kinds of protests were happening. Eventually, the government had to intervene to make the work conditions better so that people could go back to work. So these guys are saying, look, the government actually sides with the capitalists, but when you push back, the government will eventually take your side. And the more and more democratic a government becomes, it sort of becomes incumbent on the people who are in the ruling elites to pay attention. So eventually, you see other kinds of pushbacks coming from workers and worker-led parties. So you have Lenin, who was the sort of the person in charge of Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, the leader, the political leader, he is sort of proposing that women should have voting rights in Russia in 1920 and gives them that rights. And immediately you see the same kind of change happening throughout the West. In different countries like the US, women were not given voting rights until they see Russia doing it, then they suddenly change. So Marx also looks at child labor and women's labor in these factories and says this most dangerous jobs were given to children and to women. They were the chimney sweeps. They were the, getting into all these factory machinery where other people couldn't get in. The children would get into these dangerous places. They would clean the machine. And so all these arguments eventually lead to all these movements to not have child labor in factories especially, right? So these are some of the theories behind looking at the idea of coercion and co-option. Finally, we can look at something completely different. So all these complaints about the state basically representing this ruling elite which uses violence, and then talking about the degrees of violence that a state can use. And Gramsci and others are saying, well, it's not so much violence, it's co-option. Look at the production of ideologies. And then other people are saying, yeah, look at nationalism and how it disperses the fear of the state and causes buy-in. At the end of the day, we have to acknowledge in a democratic society, a state would not exist if it did not provide for the population in some way or the other, right? Because you have elected officials, they will not be able to get elected again unless they're performing something correctly. And so we see that even in the constitution of countries, in many places, they have a declaration of serving the people. So the state's performing some functions. It's not just using violence, it's offering protection or security. You have public education, public health care, roads and highways, care of public lands, public transportation, food security measures, unemployment, disability, and retirement security, governance, environmental and food and drug oversight, and you have police and defense. All of these services are necessary and they're provided through taxes and tolls and other measures, right? So we see that the state actually has to do something for us. It can't just exist in that old way where it was, basically taking our money in exchange for some kind of physical support, physical security, right? It also subsidizes the corporations. So you see research and development in the corporate sector, in the education sector, all of this money comes from the government, most of it. It also offers educational grants to the population, right? We get a lot of these Pell grants and other grants. Of course, the state functions this way in the US, but in other countries, you see degrees of these provisions. So, of course, we talked about taxation right now, borrowings. The state also offers foreign aid to other countries, right? If you look at the US, you look at some Western countries, you look at Japan, you look at China, even India has started to give aid now. Even poor countries sometimes give aid to big countries. And you'll see these cases. There's one incident during Katrina, the flood that happened in Louisiana, which basically destroyed New Orleans, right? The entire city got flooded. It was a bad time. And you see even poor countries like Bangladesh sent money to the US, and rather they sent, I think, tea to the US because people in that region needed help. So all kinds of outpouring of support happens. So let's talk about other things in the next part of the video. Let's stop here.